The Waco siege, Manson slayings, Jonestown massacre, and Columbia disaster are some of the most shocking moments in modern American history. But when you dig into the details, what really happened in these tragic events gets so much worse than the stories you know.
The fiery disintegration of Columbia ultimately led to the loss of lives and the retirement of NASA's shuttle fleet. Columbia's 28th trip into space had been delayed for 2 full years due to various issues, but when it finally lifted off on January 16, 2003, it took just 81 seconds for disaster to strike. That's when a piece of foam from the external fuel tank came off and damaged the shuttle's left wing. According to the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, the foam chunk was about 2 feet long and a foot wide, and it hit the wing's heat-resistant panels at a relative speed of roughly 500 miles per hour. However, nobody at the time noticed. It wasn't until the following day that the foam strike was seen during a review of the launch. Foam striking the orbiter during liftoff had actually been a concern since even before the shuttle first flew in 1981. Following the first flight, over 300 heat-resistant panels had to be replaced due to damage from debris, and it wasn't an isolated incident. Most shuttle launches also had foam impacts. But the damage to the Columbia was different. Rather than hitting the more fragile white or black tiles, the foam struck the reinforced gray carbon tiles on the leading edge of the wing, which were thought to be more or less indestructible. So conventional wisdom said that a foam strike to those tiles couldn't possibly cause significant damage to the shuttle, an assumption that turned out to be deadly. A day after the launch, the foam strike was detected by NASA's Intercenter Photo Working Group. Immediately concerned that severe damage could have been done to the heat-resistant tiles there, Bob Page, the group's chair, quickly went to another official and asked him to contact the Department of Defense to obtain images of Columbia. 3 days later, a debris assessment team convened, and 2 members of that group also reportedly requested imaging of the left wing, believing the images would be crucial to assessing the damage. But they never got the images. According to the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, NASA official Linda Ham blocked all 3 imaging requests, concluding that imaging wasn't required and that it would therefore waste too much time. For her part, Ham would later claim to have no knowledge of the DAT's concerns. Whatever the case, though, the debris assessment team was left flying blind, and they weren't the only ones. Without images of Columbia's left wing, the debris assessment team had to rely on computer simulators to guess what might happen on re-entry. Their conclusion, the shuttle would suffer at least some heat damage on re-entry. They just didn't know how much. In the meantime, a week after launch, NASA finally clued the flight crew in to the fact that their shuttle was damaged, but they told crew commander Rick Husband and pilot William McCool that there was, quote, no concern. NASA told them they were only being informed of the foam strike so they wouldn't be taken by surprise if reporters asked them about it when they got back. On the morning of February 1, 2003, after 16 days in space, Columbia attempted re-entry. As detailed by the Columbia Accident Investigation Report, as the shuttle was streaking over California at 8:53 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, witnesses reported seeing several flashes of light. A minute later, 4 sensors in the shuttle's damaged left wing mysteriously went offline. Columbia shed a heat-resistant tile as it crossed from New Mexico into Texas at 8:58. And a final unintelligible communique came from the orbiter a minute later. According to ABC News, a report released by NASA in 2008 indicated that the first alarm to sound inside the shuttle would have come only 4 seconds before Columbia spun out of control. However, either Rick Husband or William McCool remained conscious for an additional 26 seconds, desperately attempting to save the crew. At 9 a.m., observers on the ground could see that Columbia was in pieces, and all 7 astronauts on board had been killed. NASA immediately launched an investigation, with the government mobilizing a massive effort to collect as much of the debris from the shuttle as possible to determine exactly what happened. While some unscrupulous people tried to profit off the tragedy by selling debris, most people turned over anything they found. By March, recovery efforts were centered on East Texas, where hundreds of pieces of the Columbia had been found. And then, unthinkably, tragedy struck again. While searching for debris on the afternoon of March 27th, a helicopter carrying 5 people suffered an engine failure near the Angelina National Forest in San Augustine County, Texas. Though 3 passengers survived, pilot Jules Francis Buzz Meyer and Texas Forest Service aviation specialist Charles Crinick were killed instantly. Crinick was awarded the Star of Texas in 2004, and a monument to the Columbia crew in Hemp Hill, Texas also includes a pillar inscribed with Meyer and Crinick's names. In the aftermath of the incident, investigators inevitably asked the million-dollar question: would it have been possible to save Columbia's crew? According to the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, the answer was yes, if the damage to the left wing had been detected by either spacewalk or the requested imaging.
We availed ourselves of photographic techniques which were not used because it was not assessed as being so critical.
How? Well, the Space Shuttle Atlantis was already being prepared for its next launch. Originally scheduled to launch on March 1st, the launch could have been accomplished safely as early as February 10th. According to calculations, the Columbia crew had enough supplies to remain in orbit until February 15th, meaning the Atlantis could have flown a rescue mission. Once the two shuttles met, Columbia's crew could have spacewalked over to Atlantis for a safe return home. For the rescue scenario to have been possible, though, the damage to Columbia's left wing would have had to have been discovered by the 7th day of the mission, which it could have been if those requests for imaging hadn't been denied.
The siege at David Koresh's Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas lasted for 51 days and showed the world just how badly the FBI could mess something up. Every leader has to rise to power, but before David Koresh rose to become the leader of the Branch Davidians, it was George Roden who ruled the cult. According to the New York Times, Koresh wasn't especially fond of Roden, who he saw as squatting on his property, so he got a bunch of friends together and they invaded the sect commando style, dressed in camouflage military uniforms and carrying military-style weapons. There was a gun battle, Roden was shot in the hand, and Koresh was able to seize control of the cult. So how exactly does something like that happen without consequences? Well, there was a trial, but none of the 8 attackers was convicted of a crime. David Koresh claimed he'd been aiming at a tree, not at Roden, and the jury believed him, or at least enough of the jury to result in a deadlock. In fact, the jury believed Koresh so much that a few of them actually hugged him at the end of the trial. Now that's charisma.
I've never seen that happen before, and I haven't seen it since.
And even though authorities found enough guns on the compound to, quote, hold off the entire sheriff's department, no one was convicted of a felony, so Koresh and his cronies got to keep their guns. So why didn't the assistant district attorney decide to try David Koresh a second time? He never really said, but he did once complain that he'd been, quote, a black man trying to prosecute 7 white men in a southern town called Waco. David Koresh was just one of many, colorful characters who ruled the Branch Davidians. First, there was Victor Hatif, who established the Waco group in 1935. Then there was his wife Florence, who predicted that April 22, 1959 would mark the dawn of a new messianic age. When that doomsday didn't happen, the movement split into several factions, one of which was led by a man named Ben Roden. Ben was smart enough to tell everyone that Christ's return would depend on all of them being morally mature, which pretty much absolved him of the responsibility for being right about dates. When Ben Roden died, his wife Lois took over. When Lois died, her son George took over. In 1993, the Washington Post reported that one of the factors leading to the standoff between George Roden and David Koresh was the question of which one of them was able to successfully raise a 20-year-old corpse from the dead. Spoiler alert, neither one of them could. Even before that, George had been a less than upstanding citizen. He was sentenced to 6 months for asking God, in a legal motion, to inflict AIDS and herpes on judges. 2 years after the gunfight with David, George murdered one of his supporters with an axe, evidently because the man was yet another rival claiming to be the true Messiah. Cult leaders have all sorts of sordid techniques they use to control their subjects and brainwash them into doing crazy things. David Koresh, too, subjected his followers to some messed up stuff, like 19-hour-long sermons. He also verbally abused his followers, and his sermons could be terrifying. Grace Adams, who joined the cult in 1990 after traveling all the way from New Zealand, told CBS News that she watched him preach while wielding a boat paddle, which he would strike against the stage. Koresh often separated parents from their children, which is a special kind of torture. He wanted the kids to put him first, so he'd remove children from the care of their mothers if he felt the mother-child bond was too strong. David Koresh also told his followers that the world outside the compound was full of bad people. When he thought they were misbehaving, the punishment was severe. Grace Adams says she was locked in a 10 by 8 foot room for 4 months and fed from a bowl on the floor. Koresh finally let her go, but only when he discovered that her visa had expired. Can't have immigration knocking on the compound door. Eventually, most cult leaders decide that polygamy is cool, but only for them, because that just goes along with the whole being worshipped by other human beings thing they're doing. According to CBS News, David Koresh's revelation came in 1989 and was called the New Light, which sounds lovely and holy and everything, but was really just a pretty name for his self-professed right to be the only dude on the compound who was allowed to become a dad. Also, his relationships with his many wives didn't have to be consensual. That was okay though, as far as Koresh was concerned, because any woman who got to know him in the biblical sense of the word got to have a golden ticket to heaven, so it was a win-win. So yeah, David Koresh basically dissolved all the marriages on the compound and claimed all the women as his own. That didn't just include the adult women either. Koresh had a number of teenage wives, and some who were even younger than that. In 2003, one woman claimed she'd married Koresh when she was 10. But sure, go on about how Koresh was totally innocent of wrongdoing. Every childhood has its ups and downs, but if you were a kid on the Branch Davidian compound, it was mostly downs. Joanne Viega was just 6 when she escaped the Branch Davidians. She told ABC News, "That fear that nothing you can do is going to be good enough. You're raised with just fear. Everywhere is fear." The kids existed under constant threat of a wooden paddle called the Helper. To prepare for the battle at the end of the world, they were often made to fight each other. The boys would get up at 5:30 a.m. for gym, which was really just military training. In the early days of the siege, David Koresh allowed a few of the children to leave the compound. Not his own, though, because they were supposedly the sons and daughters of the Messiah. Most of the kids who were released spoke about their parents as if they were already dead, and they seemed almost cool with it. They told investigators things like, "Everyone is going to die, and we're going to blow you all up." These kids were so brainwashed they claimed to love David Koresh, despite the horrible things they'd experienced in the compound. No matter who you blame, no matter which side you sympathize with, there's no question the government badly screwed up the Waco incident. There are a lot of reasons why, but one of the biggest is because there were 2 teams working to end the crisis, the FBI and the Hostage Rescue Team, or HRT, and they did not agree on the best way to do things. Now, disagreeing on the best way to do things is fine if you're sitting around a table in a boardroom discussing the latest television commercial for your dumb product. But when people's lives are at stake, those kinds of major disagreements can have tragic consequences. According to PBS, the FBI favored a chill approach. Tread lightly, be patient, spend lots of time talking to people in the compound. The HRT disagreed.
Bringing these tanks and stuff around here, I tell you what, no one's gonna hurt me or my family.
So while the FBI was engaged in careful negotiation, the HRT was blasting loud music into the compound and crushing Branch Davidian vehicles. Which means negotiations came down to a battle of philosophies. Hey, if you come out, we'll treat you well, versus, hey, if you don't come out, we're going to drive you nuts with loud music and destroy all your stuff. With those kinds of mixed messages, it's not shocking that the Davidians were confused and desperate and not really willing to negotiate with either team.
I mean, these HRT guys, what makes grown men act like that?
One of the many things there's still a lot of disagreement about is who is at fault for the fire that ultimately ended the standoff and killed 75 people. According to ABC News, the survivors still say the FBI was responsible for the fires. A congressional investigation decided otherwise. There were bugs inside the compound that captured the Branch Davidians saying things like, "Start the fire," and David said, "Pour it," right? It supposedly being fuel for the fire. So that does kind of seem like a smoking gun. And aerial footage shows 3 fires starting in simultaneous locations within the compound. Regardless of where and who set the fire, the results were catastrophic. David Koresh sent the children with several women to a bunker located on the bottom level of the compound, where they all perished. Meanwhile, the people on the upper levels faced fire and tanks, which were being driven through the walls of the compound. One of the 9 survivors escaped through a hole blasted through the wall by one of the tanks, but it was too late for the people behind him. Of the 33 bodies found inside the bunker, 25 were children. A medical examiner told Frontline in 1995, most of them had died as a result of smoke inhalation or suffocation. A couple of them had died as a result of blunt trauma due to collapsing debris, but there were at least 3 kids who had been shot to death, and 1 was stabbed to death. Outside the bunker, people also died from smoke inhalation, but a few had much easier deaths, including David Koresh himself and his right-hand man, Steve Schneider. Both men were found inside the compound's communication room. Koresh died from a gunshot wound to the forehead, Schneider from a gunshot wound to the mouth. No one is really sure who shot who. Gunfire was heard coming from inside the compound during the fire, and this is where there's still a lot of disagreement. Federal agents claim that the Davidians were killing each other, either to avoid the horror of dying in a fire or because David Koresh had ordered the killing of those who tried to escape. Survivors still vehemently deny that either one of those scenarios is true, which basically just means that we're never going to know exactly what happened. A lot of people were left broken after the events of Waco. The kids who escaped the compound before its tragic conclusion grew up with the scars of everything they'd experienced while they were inside, and those who knew the victims didn't exactly move on either. David Koresh's mother, Bonnie Haldeman, told the press after his funeral, "I don't think I will ever rest in my heart. I didn't get to see the body, and I'm not even positive that it is David in the grave." Haldeman's life ended tragically, just like her son's did. In 2009, CBS News reported that she'd been found dead in her sister's home. She was 64, but she hadn't died peacefully in her sleep or anything. She died from stab wounds. Worse, Beverly Clark, her younger sister, was accused of the murder. Clark was arrested but found incompetent to stand trial, so she was moved to a medical facility where she remained for nearly 9 years. Her case wasn't resolved until 2018, when attorneys finally agreed that she'd been insane when she killed her sister. As tragic as the murders of Sharon Tate and her friends were, they have come to overshadow the Manson family's next night of terror. It was the murder of Lino and Rosemary LaBianca that plunged Los Angeles into fear and paranoia. As documented by Linda Kasabian's testimony, Charles Manson called her, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten to the bunkhouse at the family's hideaway at the Spahn Ranch after dinner on the evening of Saturday, August 9, 1969. Noting that Manson instructed the young women to bring along a change of clothing, Kasabian, who had been the lookout for the Tate killings, became uneasy knowing that she would again be sent on a murderous mission. Manson told them, "Last night was too messy. This time I'm going to show you how to do it." With Manson at the wheel, the participants in the Cielo Drive massacre, Charles Tex Watson, Krenwinkel, Susan Atkins, and Kasabian, along with Van Houten and Steve Clem Grogan, headed out in search of their next victims. After several false starts, the family at last wound up at a house in Los Feliz. Armed with a pistol, Manson exited the car and made his way up the home's long driveway alone. One of the Manson family's favorite pastimes was an activity they called creepy crawling. Family members would enter a home under the cover of night and silently creep and crawl from room to room, rearranging the sleeping occupants' possessions. During Manson's trial, Deputy District Attorney Vincent Bugliosi surmised that the creepy crawls were merely dress rehearsals for murder. In the early morning hours of Sunday, August 10, 1969, Manson slipped into the home of Lino and Rosemary LaBianca to survey the scene. According to Charles Tex Watson's memoir, Will You Die For Me?, Manson returned to the car moments later and summoned Watson to come with him. Rousing Lino LaBianca from his sleep, Manson held a gun on the grocery store president, assuring him that he wasn't going to be harmed. Manson stated he was after money and nothing else. Watson bound LaBianca's hands behind his back while Manson went to the bedroom to retrieve Rosemary. Further assuring the frightened couple that they wouldn't be hurt, Manson left the house with Rosemary LaBianca's wallet. Moments later, Patricia Krenwinkel and Leslie Van Houten entered the LaBianca home with orders to kill. As Manson's followers were left to their bloody work, Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Linda Kasabian, and Steve Clem Grogan left the scene. According to Bugliosi's book Helter Skelter, Manson gave Kasabian Rosemary LaBianca's wallet and instructed her to wipe off any incriminating fingerprints and remove the change. LaBianca's driver's license and, most importantly, her credit cards were to remain untouched. Manson explained that he was going to drive to a predominantly black neighborhood where Kasabian was to toss the wallet on the sidewalk. Explaining that a person of color would find the wallet and use the credit cards, Manson hoped that the press and the authorities would blame the murders on the Black Panthers. With the blame deflected from the family and placed on the black political organization, Manson believed that the country would edge nearer to Helter Skelter, an apocalyptic race war from which Manson and his followers would emerge as victors. Inexplicably, Manson changed his mind at the last minute and instead drove to a nearby gas station, where he instructed Kasabian to leave the wallet in the women's restroom. Kasabian, now fearful after 2 nights of murder, instead hid LaBianca's wallet inside a toilet tank rather than leaving it where it could be easily found. A key piece of evidence, the wallet was finally discovered 4 months after the August 10 killings. According to the Los Angeles Deputy DA Vincent Bugliosi, investigators were initially reluctant to link the LaBianca and Tate murders. At the time, the police regarded the LaBianca killings as a copycat crime. Regardless of the official position of the authorities, the general public could easily see the parallels in the crimes. Gripped by fear, Los Angeles held its breath, waiting for the next round of gruesome slayings. On the 50th anniversary of the Tate LaBianca murders, Linda Deutsch, the Associated Press reporter who broke the story of the Cielo Drive killings, described the mood of the city to Tara Brown of 60 Minutes Australia.
You had a city that was in lockdown. People were buying alarm systems for their houses. People carried guns.
Deutsch continued to say, people were sure that they were targets, and then when the LaBiancas were killed, that sort of cemented the idea that there were mad killers on the loose. Vincent Bugliosi told KABC TV in 2015, there was a lot of fear in LA. The sale of guard dogs and guns rose dramatically overnight, particularly in the movie colony. They were just terrified. On August 16, 1969, authorities raided Spahn Ranch and arrested Manson and 25 family members. Charged with auto theft, Manson was released when it was discovered that the arrest warrant had been misdated. As documented in Helter Skelter, Susan Atkins, jailed at the Sybil Brand Institute after being implicated in the earlier murder of music teacher Gary Hinman, leaked details of the Tate LaBianca crimes to fellow inmates, who in turn alerted authorities. Charged with murder, Manson, Tex Watson, Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten were sentenced to death. In exchange for immunity, Linda Kasabian became a witness for the prosecution. Her testimony was instrumental in convicting Manson and his followers. In 1972, California abolished the death penalty. The sentences of murderers were commuted to life. Drinking the Kool-Aid is a popular idiom used today, often in a political context, but it has a dark origin to the phrase. You might think you know the story of Jim Jones, but the popular account masks a more complicated and disturbing reality. Jim Jones ran the People's Temple from San Francisco, but the history of the church is a bit complicated. After starting in Indianapolis and traveling down to Brazil for a time, the main takeaway is that Jones always had one target for parishioners, or minorities. According to New West magazine, he mobilized San Francisco's African-American community in a crucial swing block. He was so powerful that few dared challenge him at the time, and he became what New West called one of the most politically potent religious leaders in the history of the state.
A guy like my dad found out what you wanted to hear and see and showed it to you.
In 1977, when the State Department seemed poised to intervene in a child custody case relating to Jonestown, San Francisco's politicians and local radicals leapt to defend Jones. Activist Angela Davis asked the San Francisco DA to drop all investigations into Jones, claiming his detractors wanted to stop his work for social justice. In a letter to then-President Jimmy Carter, California State Assembly member and future San Francisco Mayor Willie Brown called Jones a rare human being and a leader of the First Order. Even San Francisco Supervisor Harvey Milk begged Carter not to unleash the State Department on Jones. Had Jones not received so much protection from these people, as well as others like Mayor George Moscone and Governor Jerry Brown, People's Temple might have been investigated in 1977, before it managed to flee to South America. Even there, it seems Jones expected the city to defend him. In a tape recorded just before the massacre, Jones said, "The people in San Francisco will not take our death in vain, you know." While Jonestown was portrayed as a multiracial utopia, the reality more closely resembled a Soviet labor camp. What's often overlooked is that Jones was an admirer of communism and his political ties were with the far left. Thanks to the survivors of the massacre, America learned how Jones mentally broke his followers through a combination of food deprivation, humiliation, and punishment straight out of the USSR and communist China.
Jones was fascinated by Hitler.
Jonestown survivor Eugene Smith wrote in a Newsweek op-ed that even when the cult was still in the US, Jones kept an iron grip. If you broke the rules, Jones dressed you down in front of everyone else. You didn't defend yourself, you just took it. Additionally, the residents were encouraged to criticize themselves to Jones, whether in person or in writing, a practice that was nearly identical to communist Chinese struggle sessions meant to keep potential defectors in line. Life wasn't much better day to day.
I mean, I've never been on a plantation, but my God, it was a plantation, and he was the master.
Work consisted of 8 to 12-hour days in the jungle, with most meals consisting mainly of rice. Jonestown's inhabitants were kept on a low-protein diet, no doubt to keep them weak and pliable. What they were fed was a daily diet of propaganda about America's impending collapse and how bad life was elsewhere, kinda like North Korea does today. Among the worst forms of psychological torture Jones employed was the infamous White Night. This was Jones's way of sounding the alarm when he claimed the commune was about to come under attack. According to Smith, everyone would run to the pavilion and Jim Jones would talk and prophesize and go off on his rants and raves for hours and hours. He was strung out.
Dad, like any good demagogue, would conjure up fear.
Survivors gave varying descriptions of White Nights, but they were undoubtedly a form of manipulation. The meetings, apart from depriving people of sleep, kept everyone in a heightened state of stress regarding the possibility of the Guyanese army invading the commune and slaughtering the inhabitants. This reinforced people's loyalty to Jones, who promised protection but expected everyone to be ready to die for the cause. They practiced this too. A handful of White Nights were described as mass suicide rehearsals, the grim foreshadowing of the massacre that occurred in November of 1978. While San Francisco Democrats ran cover for Jim Jones, California Democratic Congressman Leo Ryan broke ranks with his party to investigate. After New West magazine published a damning article regarding abuse in Jones's cult, the People's Temple moved to Guyana, where members were reportedly forbidden to leave. Ryan went there to investigate and lost his life as a result. Before we go any further, we need to briefly explain the geography of Guyana. Jonestown is about 140 miles outside of the capital city of Georgetown, in the middle of the jungle. The nearest airport is 60 miles away, on what is mostly a dirt road over uneven terrain. So Jones chose this location to make it very hard to get in and out of his utopia, and that played to his advantage. Accompanying Ryan was journalist Tim Reiterman, who published his experiences in the San Francisco Examiner in 1978. Reiterman said Jones carefully choreographed the visit to make Jonestown look like a thriving settlement.
Whatever the comments are, there are some people here who believe that this is the best thing that ever happened to them in their whole life.
But the charade collapsed when two members handed Ryan a note begging the congressman to save them. At least 14 more joined them in their attempt to escape, something Jones wouldn't tolerate.
What is your wish today?
To go back home.
And where is home?
U.S.
Before the group even left Jonestown for the airport, things got very dicey. A few church loyalists inspected the trucks carrying the fleeing members, and that culminated with Congressman Ryan having a knife held to his throat. Cooler heads prevailed, and they all thought they were in the clear to return to the U.S. Unbeknownst to Ryan, however, a member of Jones's Red Brigade, Larry Layton, had joined the defectors as a saboteur. After arriving in Port Kaituma for their flight home, Layton signaled to a handful of men in a tractor who'd been following the party.
I turned to Larry Layton, I said, "They're killing everyone, they're killing everyone." And then he shot me 3 times, point blank.
In the resulting firefights, Ryan and several others were killed. In 1986, Layton would be the only person convicted for the killings. Speaking to a packed house at Lincoln Land Community College in 2014, People's Temple Financial Secretary and Jonestown survivor Deborah Layton declared nobody committed suicide at Jonestown. It was a massacre.
I mean, it's like 900 people, so no, it wasn't all suicide.
With those words, Layton busted Jonestown's most enduring myth, that it was history's largest mass suicide. In a 2021 Time magazine article, Odell Rhodes, who survived Jonestown, agreed. Although some followed Jones's order, 300 children and infants were forced to drink the cyanide-laced Flavor Aid. And yes, it wasn't even Kool-Aid, it was the other brand of sugary drink. If the kids weren't willing to sip the poison, their mothers were ordered to squirt the drink into their mouths with a syringe. The gruesome scene haunted witnesses for years, with one worker writing, "Can't sleep, can I get the small children out of my mind?"
This is a beautiful place here, and it's fun over here. It's really good.
As for the adults who didn't want to go along with the plan, Jones had a solution for them as well. Rhodes said he saw them herded back to the pavilion at gunpoint and coerced into drinking the poison. According to a Guyanese pathologist, up to 90% of Jonestown's victims were forcibly injected, shot, or strangled. So yes, Jonestown was really a mass murder. Among the few who definitively died by suicide was Jones himself. According to a Washington Post interview with his son Stephen, Jones was too prideful to let anyone else kill him. Despite the fact that the People's Temple drew its membership from the poorer echelons of American society, the group itself was far from poor. Jones's well-funded operation had around $27 million in total assets. These included $7 million in cash stashed away in Venezuelan and Panamanian bank accounts. According to the New York Times, the members of the People's Temple left all the liquid assets to the USSR with the explanation, "We, as communists, want our money to be a benefit for help to oppressed peoples all over the world, or in any way that your decision-making body sees fit." The Times report drew heavily on the activities of Jones loyalist Maria Casares, who was tasked with organizing the delivery of some of the funds to the Soviet embassy in the Guyanese capital. She visited Panama and Venezuela several times, suggesting she was Jones's primary financial go-between with the banks. Jones's wife Marceline left another note transferring money in Canada and the Bahamas. Again, a sign that the cult was far from poor. It doesn't appear the USSR ever received the money, and Moscow refused to comment on the matter. While most of the Jonestown massacre took place in the commune, a second, smaller massacre was taking place at the People's Temple headquarters in the Guyanese capital of Georgetown, at the hands of Jones loyalist Sharon Amos. According to her nephew August and his mother Robin, Jones ordered cult members at the Georgetown headquarters to kill themselves, but most of them refused. Amos, however, chose to carry out a horrific act on Jones's order with fellow cult member Charles Beichman. She took her 3 children to a bathroom where she did the unspeakable. We're not even gonna speak it. Let's just say that she was loyal to Jones through and through. 10-year-old Stephanie Brown, who was supposed to be killed by Beichman, survived. Beichman only cut her superficially to make it seem to Amos that he had carried out Jones's orders. In doing so, he saved her life. At Beichman's trial, he received a reduced sentence of 5 years on an attempted murder charge thanks to his refusal to kill the girl. Why did the Guyanese government allow Jones and the People's Temple to settle there in the first place? The answer was political expediency, despite the flashing red warning signs that Jones wasn't all he claimed to be. In the 1970s, Guyana was a poor, underdeveloped country covered in inaccessible jungle. According to San Diego State University professor Khalil Muhammad, Guyana wanted foreigners with a socialist bent who were willing to develop the interior, and a mostly black, ostensibly Christian movement seemed like the perfect way to get it done. The idea was all the more attractive due to Guyana's conflict with Venezuela over the Essequibo region. Jones would settle the borderlands, strengthen Guyana's claims to the area, and make it economically viable. He used his money to bribe police, army personnel, and officials to look the other way when reports of abuse surfaced, setting the scene for November 1978. After the tragedy, the Guyanese government, possibly aided by the United States, went into cover-up mode. According to the testimony of Dr. Leslie Mutu, the pathologist assigned to the case, there was evidence of forcible injection and gunshot wounds on the vast majority of the bodies. That evidence was buried to make it look like a mass suicide.
These are the bodies of unidentified children. In place of names, just numbers on the boxes.
The People's Temple was around 70% African American in 1978 when the Jonestown massacre occurred. Many followed Jim Jones because at one point he seemed like the real deal, seeking to turn Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech into reality. In this aspect, the People's Temple did well. Anyone was welcome there, including mixed-race couples whose marriages were illegal in many states until 1967. When Jones moved operations to San Francisco, his mostly black congregants saw him as their fighter in City Hall and in Sacramento.
All lies.
None of it was true.
I mean, he sold us a bill of goods.
In the end, this is perhaps the saddest part of the Jonestown saga. Was Jones the real deal who went mad with power, or was he always a manipulative sociopath? Survivors' accounts suggest the latter, meaning that Jones took advantage of some of America's most vulnerable and isolated. But to what end? Jones would have said it was for the revolution, but his bank accounts suggest it was the same old, money, power, and control over his fellow man.